All righty. I thought we would use um, the same method we did a few times ago that seemed to work very well, and that's that if you want to respond to something that was just said, a brief response in reaction to what someone just said, stick your hand up. If you want to say move to a slightly different topic, then go ahead and put up your electronic hand. Okay, now I'm just going to start off with a little brief introduction. Hopefully you got a chance to read the 8 or 9 page introduction I wrote, not having done so. Okay, a model in psychology is a way to predict psychological outcomes and explain processes that cannot be precisely defined by neuroscience at this time. Today, we're discussing what I call the mindfulness model. Unlike the psychoanalytic model, which is all-encompassing, and rather like the mental immunity model, it focuses on a specific problematic portion of human behavior. From an evolutionary standpoint, our brain, like the rest of our bodies, evolved to protect our DNA. How does it do that? Well, our brain uses senses to examine the world around us, perceive things, people, and situations that it determines to be important to us, and makes what I call dualistic judgments about them. Yes, I like it. It's good for me. I must get some. Or no, it's bad for me. I must get away from it, avoid it, kill it. Ambiguity was dangerous in the savannas 100,000 years ago, so our brains have evolved a cognitive bias that pushes us to black and white. So we tend to eschew doubt and rush to a decisive conclusion, thus the strong duality. Most of the things your brain perceives it views as innocuous, and on other things your brain makes judgments that range from very strong to very weak and hardly noticeable. Very often you experience a constant stream of these judgments as you move throughout your day, but they tend to be somewhat subconscious. When something in your environment triggers memory of a judgment that has been made, encountering a significant person or situation, your brain pushes you to instantly embrace the decision it has made in regard to that, to either avoid it uh, or approach it. Yes, no, good, bad, love it, hate it. Feelings and emotions are then your conscious experience of this judgment and instructions. Now, a portion of your brain's function I will call the self goes one step further. It tells you that in regard to each judgment it is pushing on you, if things don't come to pass in conformity with that judgment, you will be unhappy. It creates a sense of dissatisfaction. Early Buddhist translations into English just called it suffering, but modern folks, both Western and Eastern, feel that anguish or dissatisfaction is a better term. I'll call it anguish dissatisfaction. So in any particular situation, some stimulus triggers a judgment that your brain has made, or it makes a new one right on the spot. Your brain pushes you to either seek or avoid something. You respond reactively to try to affect that judgment, and failing to do so, you feel dissatisfied and unhappy. Or if you succeed in your efforts, you may feel a giddiness, or worse, your ego may feel inflated. This is what we refer to as an instance of mindlessness, reactively, unthinkingly attempting to execute a judgment by your Neolithic brain. Okay, and this is especially problematic nowadays because so many of your brain's judgments are an evolutionary mismatch. Now, some people discovered a long time ago that it's possible to make your brain function in a different way, to establish a different relationship with the self. It is possible to adopt a clear, non-judgmental awareness, in effect, when some environmental stimulus triggers a judgment and accompanying instructions, to simply see that that is happening, not to identify with it, not to say, in effect, yeah, that's me. I got to get some of that. Or, yeah, that's me. I hate that. I'm going to wipe that out. Instead, to simply look and see that you are creating it. The formal name for this is insight. It is generally difficult to achieve because your self is relentless, pushing these judgments and their accompanying strong feelings at you on a regular basis. There are times when it is so strong, one must simply step away. But when one sees judgments being foisted upon oneself, there are two positive outcomes. One, because one does not identify with it, the feeling weakens and dissipates faster. And number two, one is allowed to make another choice. One can make a dispassionate evaluation and perhaps come to a different conclusion than oneself did. As you can imagine, there are a lot of instances of evolutionary mismatch. And there is a complication. The majority of judgments that yourself makes are indeed wise ones that you do respond. The majority of judgments yourselves make are indeed wise ones that you do respond reactively to. You see a red light at an intersection, you step on the brake. So things do get complicated, but it is always wiser to be in a position of seeing, of knowing what your choices, what your previous choices are. Now, the tools for achieving the ability to have this insight include, as you might imagine, meditation, consciously sitting back and watching what comes out of your brain, using what we call the RAIN technique, just recognizing that it's there is big, allowing it to be there, inspecting it, non-identifying, don't identify with it. There is another feature of yourself. When your brain is not doing anything else, a portion of it called the default mode network runs narratives by you, stories that involve the judgments it has made, confirming them and getting you, in effect, to practice responding to them mindlessly. Daydreaming is a form of these narratives. So anything that throws a monkey wrench into this process is helpful. Thus, another mindful tool, the tool of being here now, focusing on present observations rather than the dramas that are occurring in your mind, are very, very, very helpful. Now, being able to have this insight into what your brain is creating is often referred to as liberation, because in fact, you see what your brain is throwing at you, and you are thereby not obliged to react to it in a predetermined manner. You are freed from that cycle. Now, this was pulled out of Eastern Eastern religious practice, and pretty much in the mid to late 20th century. The first person to pull it out was a fellow by the name of Stephen Batchelor, who did so philosophically. It's the first person to apply it to a real use was John Kabat-Zinn from my alma mater, UMass, and he applied it towards people with chronic conditions who, in addition to having the condition, sit there and say, oh my God, this is awful. I'm going to have to live with this the rest of my life. Oh my God, oh my God. And are able to establish a different relationship with it. And as I understand, some insurance companies have embraced that too. They cover it. So in closing here, very quickly, historically, mindfulness has always been applied in the context of judgments that are made in protection of the self. But we know through evolutionary science that your brain also pushes you to protect those to whom you're genetically related and to your parochial group, tribe. If so, why should we not be able to apply mindfulness to assist in recognizing and transcending the coalitionary impetus that Homo sapiens has evolved? And, of course, that's what pro-social is all about, is altering or transcending that coalitionary impetus. I'm suggesting that we can transcend it. And now I'm going to open it up for questions, discussion, other ideas. I see a hand, Hank?
Yeah. Oh, it's quite simply put, sophisticatedly put, reasonably exhaustive, and a lot to build on. So thanks for that. I just have I put it in the chat. Did you include a paper in the invite? Because I didn't see it. I just saw some other from the Guardian. So that's just.
Oh yeah, below it on the bottom, there was something that basically said what I just said in 9 pages. It expanded it quite a bit, and it is there.
Oh, it's there. Oh, okay. Thanks.
It's not in the email, but if you go to Hilo and look at the event just below it, you'll see the link
right.
to.
So my question is, in the context of this, are we going to look at the evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology component of mindfulness? Is it an adaptive function for evolutionary fitness. So I wanted to bring us back to our general theme.
Okay, well, that was the general theme was I was looking at the evolutionary uh, where mindlessness came from an evolutionary standpoint, and that is
Okay.
that our brain pushes us to make snap decisions. But the very last thing I was going to talk about, the last question I was going to ask is, how the heck did mindfulness, our
Yeah.
ability to do that, how did that evolve? And I don't know how, but I was saving that for just about the last thing we were going to talk about. But we can talk about whatever you want. I don't know how it evolved. And in fact, the last words of that paper that you didn't get to read says, how did this evolve? I don't know. Maybe it's what they call a spandrel. It just happens to be there. It evolved
Yeah.
by coincidence.
Well, I'll say something, but just quickly. I don't want to. I can monopolize questions
Okay,
and
well,
thoughts, but
Diane's got her hand up. Can we let her
okay.
get something in? Go ahead, Diane.
I feel like it would be useful if we had a couple of definitions. One of them being, what do we mean by self? And number two, what do we mean by consciousness?
Pick something easy.
You're
Well,
right. Exactly.
Okay, do you want to respond to that, Stephen? Or do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I wanted to put a postscript on what Diane just said.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing Diane asked, what is consciousness? Ken, you and I had a brief email exchange in preparation for today's meeting, and I had commented that although I understand the value of meditation, that I said it's not for me because I don't like altered states of consciousness. And you said it wasn't an altered state of consciousness, it was an altered state of attention. And I thought to myself afterwards, what's the difference? That consciousness is and different forms of consciousness are different forms of attention. So what's the difference? I guess the postscript is, what's the difference between consciousness and attention?
Oh boy, that's a good one. Well, my intent, let me just answer Diane's first question, and that's that what I referred to as the self, and I said so in the paper, and I said so briefly today in the introduction, that self is the what I'm calling the self. And again, this is a model, so it's nothing more than the id, ego, or superego in psychoanalysis. It's a portion of the brain that pushes you, that says, if you don't do this, if you don't make it the way I want, the choices I've made, you're going to be miserable. You're going to be unhappy. That's what the self does. And the second question, the difference between attention and consciousness. Well, and we're going to just get caught in semantics here, but you and I can be conscious, and yet we can be focusing on different things. One person in consciousness can be just sitting there, and his default mode network can be running a memory of the party last week by him, and yeah, blah blah blah. Someone else can instead be focusing on a particular thought or concentrating. So consciousness and attention are, to me, are very different. Attention is something that you can do with consciousness.
Okay.
Rob, does that answer your question, Steve?
Yeah, sort of. I was thinking about, then I'm conscious when I'm sleeping because my brain is still attending to things.
Well, again,
That's an altered state.
Brain is
Yeah, that's an
way more
altered
than
state.
consciousness.
okay,
Mhm.
Rob had a hand up briefly, I thought.
This is reminding me of Tversky and Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. That
Yeah.
fast thinking is instinctive and reactive and useful in day-to-day life, but slow thinking is a way of weighing. And I think that mindfulness probably or possibly evolutionarily evolves because if you sit and kind of grok the environment, you can draw conclusions win, and how you react depends on the outcome. I mean, the outcome depends on how you react. So it seems to me that mindfulness is a form of slow thinking.
So what you're suggesting, which is very interesting, is that, obviously mindlessness evolved because it allows you to make a snap decision and do things when you absolutely need to very quickly. But that later on, you may change the sort of the choices you make based upon a more dispassionate contemplation of events.
Right.
So it could have evolved into the species.
Yeah, you just don't want to get eaten by the tiger while you're contemplating.
Mhm.
Okay, I think
Mm,
Hank has a hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Let's,
my hand isn't up because I don't have a hand on my computer.
Oh,
you
I'm
have a
sorry,
regular
who is,
hand?
who is this? Who is
Hey,
this?
there we
Hand.
Lon,
Yeah.
Hank, can we let Lon go?
I-
Sure.
I think, I think,
I was glad to see he had his hand. That's all.
Lon,
I
go
think
for it.
that what you're talking about is the evolution that happened when we expanded from the tribe. And that's explained, I think, I don't remember the authors, but the triumph of the friendliness is what they talk about. And Homo sapiens won out over the Neanderthals and other the pre-existing tribes because of their cooperative communication. And that's what I think you're talking about in terms of people living together in society.
Yes, well, it
And
actually started biologically. It started by people adopting different roles in defense of a common nest, what is commonly known as a eusocial evolutionary pattern. And
yeah,
then it co-evolved with culture, and that communication, groups that coalesced did well, and groups that coalesced had communication, social control, and altruism. And that's how
and
those
and
things evolved to the
and the
species.
problem Darwin had was that he didn't have the understanding of the complexity of that process.
Correct.
He was born in the age of Newton, and he had to think of connections.
Right. He had
And
no idea.
they're not there.
Right. And we didn't have it until the last 30 or 40 years, actually.
Yeah.
60 years ago, Hamilton was saying that it's an outgrowth of genetic relationship. And that's obviously not quite, doesn't quite cover it all. But we're
It
here
emerged.
what I wanted to do is to ask, what do we, now that we know that we have this coalitionary cognition, how do we get it? Because that's obviously what's behind what's happening in Ukraine and Gaza, what's been happening in continuous wars over the world. How do we, and I'm wondering if we cannot apply mindfulness in order to transcend that impetus, that feeling we have to join up, gang up, and fight.
I think the answer is certainly yes, but getting there is a complex process.
Mhm.
And that complex process, I like to think of it in terms of Aaron Antonovsky's coherence. It's made up of control, understanding, and meaning. And you get control, well, financially partly, in large part financially, but also with the understanding that we have.
What
And
was
you
that?
get meaning,
What
and
was
you
that
get
name
meaning
again?
from working with others.
What was that name again?
The guy that the sense of coherence guy,
Yeah,
Aaron Antonovsky. He wrote
Aaron
Aaron, Aaron. He wrote back in the 70s.
Antonov.
He studied a group of people who he saw as being healthy and came up with the sense of coherence behind that. But it's got three elements, and that makes it complex.
Mm-hmm.
Beer is a three element. You have hops and barley and what's the other one? Water. Anyway, you can make thousands of different kind of beers from three elements. And
Okay.
those
Well,
three elements are what make coherent.
okay. I just want to add, by the way, before I go to Hank, is that John Kabat-Zinn, by the way, has now for some years, I don't know if he's still doing it, but for a good while was meeting with members of governments in Europe. I believe he addressed a few parliaments there.
Mhm.
advocating the use of mindfulness in governmental, presumably international matters would be the place where it would be the most important. Hank?
Yeah, I want to go back to some definition of consciousness, but from a neurobiology of the brain component. So I can't think of all the authors, but there's a whole notion of, and they, instead of using consciousness like transcendence, or I'm talking about the workings of the brain. And so they talk about different levels of awareness, not in the Freudian sense of the conscious, the pre-conscious, and the unconscious, but they use the term non-conscious in terms of the brain's workings, not the mind. And the couple of suppositions are that we can only become aware of awareness of about 10% of what the brain is doing, the billions of actions every second and every minute and every hour of the day. So, so I want to call that, instead of consciousness right now, without the transcendental, which is hard to define, that it's about awareness. So that's one part. The other is, and this is somebody, I think Ron or somebody mentioned altered states. And I think if, as a therapist, and having looked at this in terms of how I work and how I think along with others, we can think of, if you're in a good mood, that's an altered state. If you're in a neutral mood, you're in an altered state. If you're in a bad mood, if you have a psychosis, or you're excited. So I think I look at, when I use mindfulness in my work, I don't have people meditate, but I use the principles, and it's a way of helping people distance from their, what you said, Ken, is their reactivity. So now the big question is, how do we do that with a mob? You know, as the Australian Aborigines say, that's another issue. But I just wanted to introduce these factors to when we talk about mindfulness, is an attempt to move from that more primitive state, based on your definition, the reactive state, to a more, let's call in mental immunity, a more reasonable state where we're less, where the, let's say, where the
Simply a more insightful state.
Yeah, but I'm going to use different words in neurobiology, where the neocortex becomes disabled and goes back to the primitive state when the amygdala is catching too much, is overwhelmed with trauma, with information. So I like to use that language rather than, you know, sort of the more philosophical aspect of mindfulness, or the ancients' view of it, which is, it's beautiful. So here's my contribution.
Okay. May I just ask very briefly, for those here who are in some sort of, who are practicing psychotherapists, do you use any elements of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy? Do you? And this a head nod would do. Do you use any of that in your practice? You do, Steve?
I did before I retired, but yes. And it fits pretty well with the comment that I wanted to make. So I put my hand up before Hank was speaking, but where Hank ended up and where the question you just asked is pretty relevant to what I wanted to address. At the end of your introductory remarks, you talked about de-identification with the self. That one of the things that a meditative state can achieve is that kind of passive observance of thoughts and feelings without necessarily identifying them. And I think that that's a therapeutic technique that is called, in ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, it's called cognitive diffusion, which is a fancy term for sort of being able to distance yourself from your thoughts. Long before acceptance and commitment therapy was around, there was a psychiatrist whose name escapes me now, out at UCLA, who developed a cognitive treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder. And one of the components of that treatment was to teach clients that when they had an obsessive thought or an urge to do a compulsive behavior, to say to themselves, that's not me, that's my OCD, which has a clever rhyme to it. But as you can readily see, a self-instruction, that's not me, that's my OCD, is a way of distancing oneself from the symptoms, saying that I am not the symptoms. So, last comment, to go back to your question you posed at the very end. So how do I'm going to rephrase it in different language. How do we scale cognitive diffusion up so it can be used on a societal level to help people not identify with the tribalism, the parochialism that you've mentioned? I'm not sure the answer to that, but I would say that I think that is probably an easier lift than trying to teach the world to be able to meditate. That to achieve, my understanding is that it takes years of hard work to really become good at meditation. That's probably not realistic tool to scale up and have millions of Homo sapiens do. But that more cognitive base, pulling that technique of cognitive diffusion out of it and teaching people to simply self-instruct and create a little bit of space between themselves and their thoughts and their feelings without full meditation, that seems more doable. I'm still not sure how one would implement that on a massive scale, but it feels more doable than teaching everybody how to meditate.
Oh, very much so. In fact, I was thinking it can even be accomplished subliminally. Imagine a television commercial where an attractive young woman and a man, and you see it from his viewpoint, sitting next to this woman, are at a stock car race, and she's having fun and they're wonderful, and then she turns and her face goes like this: "Is what? Oh, are you getting pissed off again? Oh, you're not going to do this again, are you?" And then she just shakes her head. "What's going on?" And then she moves over one seat. End of commercial. I mean, even things like that can be helpful in segments of
what is that commercial selling? What's the product?
It's selling the the last question she asked, "What's going on with you now?" And that's just understanding what's up.
Okay.
I don't know that this is going to be a particularly successful one, but I think there may even be subliminal ways that we can advertise such matters. But the other thing that I was going to suggest in applying it to a nation is we might reach a point, it's possible that we can reach a point where anyone that's involved with making international decisions be certified to be certain that he's not exercising his the biologically based tendency to coalesce and think less of another group. And I know that's very difficult.
We can't even get them certified that they're not cognitively impaired. So I think we're going to have a hard time.
I didn't say it was going to be easy. I never said it was going to be easy. But and of course it's going to be the places where it's going to be the most difficult are in countries that are particularly religious, like India and the United States. The United States being the second most religious country in the world after India. Adaptive fictions get in the way. Never said it would be easy. But I'm sitting there and I'm comparing this to, we'll go to you just a sec. I'm comparing this to David Sloan's idea that of a rapid cultural evolution, that we're suddenly all going to be small group oriented, hierarchically oriented, and stop competing, fighting with each other. I don't know. That one doesn't look too good. Okay, Lon, did you have
Yeah.
your?
I just finished writing a book on what you're talking about.
Oh,
And it's based on looking at our social defenses.
mhm.
And the point of the defenses is, as a physician, and I'm a physician and a historian and a meditator, and I recommend meditation in my practice, and people do it, and it lowers their blood pressure.
Mhm.
But I also found a way to optimize our nasal defenses. And when you optimize your nasal defenses as a physician, you're getting rid of allergies and infectious diseases that get into our airway. That includes most bacterial infections as well as COVID. And those physiological defenses have a very familiar sense when we look at our social defenses. And you can empower our social defenses just like you can empower our physiological defenses. And the way to do that is by focusing on Antonovsky's coherence, by asking yourself when you're confronted with something that threatens you, you want to recognize that as a tool to put you in your lizard brain, in your acute stress response, where the only options are fighting, flying away, or freezing. Those options are paralyzing. And that's how most of us live our days, is looking at those options. Because that stress response started millions and millions of years ago, and we all inherited, like you pointed out, in our amygdalas. That's the part that triggers the stress. And you want to stay in your cognitive brain. So the first step is looking and saying, is this threatening me? And if it is, take a deep breath. Take 2 or 3. Take deep breaths for 5 minutes, and you put yourself back in your system 2 brain.
Okay, this sounds a little bit like it's getting into the sphere of Andy Norman and mental immunity. I thought. Let's go quickly to Hank and then Diane.
Okay, Lon, thanks. I'd like you to put in the name of your book in the chat so I can look at it.
Well, the first one is Common Sense Medicine. It's available at Amazon. The second one is also Common Sense Medicine, but it's not out yet.
Oh,
But,
okay.
I'll give you my email, and if you want a copy of it, I will send you. I just finished. What would I call it? A last time edit. I hope, and I'll send that to you in PDF if you want it.
Oh, wonderful.
My
Thanks.
email address is Delta.
Well, why don't you put that in the chat? Why don't you put that in the chat, Lou?
I'll do that.
Okay, so I just wanted to get back to a bit of particular along the lines of what Lon is describing, but I was thinking about how I formulate in my work with individuals, not with groups of people. I'm not a social change guy. I don't know how to do it. I don't have a way with that, but I value it. But what I do with people, I wrote in the chat, in psychoanalysis, Freud talked about this witnessing. He called it the developing and observing ego. Now we're talking about Freud's language, not talking about witnessing like in the Buddhist world. So your basic job as a therapist, I think the therapist here would know that all these different models, they involve helping somebody move away from that early reactive brain to the more, like in Andy Norman's book, and he's doing it from a philosophical point of view, but lots of very good mental health-ish paradigms come out of that he's not writing about. So what I do is just the way I do it with people. I'll teach them about. I'll say, instead of doing what you do as a psychotherapist, you have a dialogue, you have an interchange, you think about things, you navel gaze, whatever you do. That's one model of work. The other is to help to develop this observing ego, is to say, notice what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, what you're sensing. Notice that you make judgments. If you are, let the judgments go, forget about them, and let them go into let them lay fallow. And trust that this stuff will come up when we need to do the other aspect. So I just wanted to say how I use it with individuals or with couples. I haven't done it with groups in a long time. So yeah.
That's cool. I'm very familiar with psychoanalysis, his model, and I had not heard of his emphasis on that before. That sounds very much like mindfulness.
Oh, it's the central, like in the old days, when I learned it and the people before me, they talk about, is somebody eligible for psychoanalysis? You know, it's like the elite. And you assess if they have the capacity or the history or of being able to step back and observe themselves from a distance. Nobody cared about Buddhism or any of the things we're talking about. But then they decided, well, that's only the neurotic people who are able to have an observing ego, and that's going to take years of work. So we've come a long way from that. But yeah, it's part and parcel of it. And I think I don't give Freud's made a lot of mistakes, and he didn't know a lot of things because of his time. But I think the other new techniques, the ACT and all that, the behavioral stuff, they don't give credit to at least him and the philosophers before him. So that's my other pet peeve. But
Quite true, quite true. Diane?
Yeah, I want to go back to consciousness and a different master who would be William James, because he asked the question, what is the function of consciousness? And his answer was essentially that the function of consciousness is to make it possible for us to make choices. Okay? But when you look at what we are conscious of, or what, and the things that we're not conscious of also, it turns out that this pure observation is only a tiny part of consciousness. There are thoughts, there's information, there's perceptions, there's and especially feelings, motivations, emotions. And so it seems to me that the mindfulness approach primarily means to disengage from the emotion, not necessarily from the information, which makes it a very, to use non-technical language, mental kind of, all of this is mental, obviously, in one meaning of the word, but the suffering that you talk about, or the anguish, is emotional, right? I mean, we're not talking about physical pain. We're talking about disappointment, anger, frustration, resentment, desire for revenge, etc., etc.
love.
Also, love, to my understanding, Buddhism usually boils everything down to desire. The desire that things should be different. I think, I don't know, Ken, would you agree
that's a
with that,
word that is used, I think, once again, everything was transcribed, everything was translated from Pali and Sanskrit. And so we made some mistakes. For example, calling this dukkha, we called it suffering. And in fact, it's really sort of a persistent, anguished dissatisfaction. So we weren't precise enough.
Anguish is even heavier than suffering.
Well, depends on how you define suffering. I mean, if your leg got snapped in two, you're going to suffer pretty heavily. I don't know if you can...
Right, and you'll be in anguish as well. But anyway, I wanted to add one more thought to this. What is the function of consciousness, and what are the contents of consciousness? But also the individual versus the social level. And we seem to be, as a group, kind of concerned with translating across these levels. But I wonder whether group consciousness can really be compared with individual consciousness. Because if we're saying, can we get group consciousness to somehow resemble this more disciplined individual consciousness?
I don't think that's what they're saying, Diane. I think what they're saying is, how do you get all the individuals in a group to do this? I mean, I don't know what group consciousness is.
Well, I don't either. But as a social psychologist, excuse me, Lon, I'm going to say one more thing. We are not ever really separate individuals.
Oh, no.
We are always a part of our groups, a part of our history, a part of et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that it's going to flow out from the individual seems somehow implausible to me.
Well, just let me mention, by the way, and that is what people have observed as one of the effects of a good mindfulness practice. When you're constantly looking at the judgment that yourself is making and stepping away from them, well, suddenly you start to see yourself along with everyone else. One of the things you get away from is me. We look at the world through me, and and you begin to see the boundaries begin to fall away. And okay, Lon, did you have a quick reaction to that?
Yeah, they call those groups mobs.
Hobbes?
Mobs. They share their group
No.
consciousness. It's not something that's desirable.
Well, there aren't there some mobs today that you can pull up on the internet and they'll all get together and that may be very desirable. Steve?
Well,
Well,
they get
yeah.
together often to do the wrong things.
Yeah, well, we're a mob right now.
Mhm.
I just wanted to comment on the topic of suffering and relate it to the cognitive diffusion distancing issue we were talking about earlier. I have a friend who is a pain psychologist, works in a pain clinic as a psychologist, and he said something that many years ago to me that I only now I think I understand. I didn't really get it 20 years ago when he said it to me. He said, "I can't change anyone's pain, but I can change their suffering," which now I understand. It's they're going to change how you relate to the pain cognitively and emotionally. And I thought that distinction between pain and suffering was perceptive on his part, and it kind of relates again to that last. What I take as the real key takeaway from all of this for me, which is that ability to have some cognitive diffusion and be able to step back, which fits in with Rob's earlier comment too, I think, about the fast and slow thinking. You can't do cognitive diffusion unless you're doing slow thinking, I think. Yeah.
I hope Jesus was an expert
An expert in,
in cognitive diffusion.
I hadn't thought about that, but
The
I don't know. He's
golden
pretty
rule is exactly that.
He's a pretty passionate guy. I'm not sure how much he could step back.
what did you say, Diane?
I
Sorry.
said the golden
Diane.
rule is exactly that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I have a comment for Diane.
he seemed to
Um,
act very
Brief.
very reactively when he swept all of those coins off the table
Mhm.
with changers in the temple.
He was an impetuous young man at the time.
Impetuous young man.
That's what probably cost him his life.
When
He
he
didn't
swept
live
all
long
those
enough. Yeah.
when he swept all those coins off the table, he was arguing against the powers that be.
Right. That's
What
what
he
cost it.
He was not dealing with individuals and their problems. He was
That's what cost him
with
his life,
social
is
problems.
arguing with the powers
Yeah.
that be. Yes.
Yeah, he
As
was
far as Diane's
affecting the
comment
income
on
of
Diane's
the
comment
high
on
priest.
consciousness and what consciousness is, you would be very interested in reading Michael Levine's article in Scientific American recently, where he said mind is everywhere. He took cells and put them together, and two cells have a mind. They have consciousness without a brain. Interesting article, interesting concept.
Well, I was going to react to that, if I
yes.
may. If I have my hand up. If your brain is not, if you're not engaging in that kind of conscious reflective stuff that we talked about, the brain having a reactive side and then a reflective side that may have evolved in because it allows you to perhaps make better decisions. If all you're doing is things that are hardwired, you may have no consciousness at all. I think it could be argued that an ant doesn't have consciousness. It just has specific reactions, and as there is never any doubt, never any, should I do this or that? Nope, they put the antenna down exactly the same way every time.
Levine argues against that.
Okay.
It's an interesting article, Scientific American, probably January or February.
The Gaia idea.
Okay, I guess
Yeah,
I think
very
Hank
much so.
has Hank, is there your hand up for a new?
Yeah, that's new. Let's see. I think I want to go back to I did a lot of studies. I did a lot of group therapy and consulted in organizations. But in my academic studying, I want to go back to the hypothesis of Carl Jung and the collective unconscious, whatever that's about, and then try to tie it in with the neurobiology of the brain. And Andy Norman does it in his philosophical way when he talks about the virus. Okay, but he doesn't go into the neurobiology of it. There's something about interpersonal neuroregulation. I don't know if people are familiar with that particular popular piece of work in the last 30 or 40 years, maybe even less. It's in there in all the neurobiology of the brain, and the experimental psychologists and psychiatrists and scientists are doing work on it. But think of it as the mob in the sense of the Aborigine. The mob is any large group that has a mob something in common. I'm going to call that, as part of dual inheritance theory, I'm going to call it the cultural inheritance. And I don't know, mind is everywhere, but I do agree that and I think Diane, you said it too, that we're part of the bigger picture. But can you, and this is Ken's issue, can we get large groups to separate from the cultural inheritance subgroup of their particular mob rather than the global mob? But in neuroregulation, it's we're doing it. Now, can you neuroregulate to fall in love or to be kind? Yes. But you can also neuroregulate to cause a lot of trouble and do harm. So I think it's not about teaching mindfulness, but sort of looking at the bigger picture from evolutionary biology and the neurobiology of the brain to see, like, well, how can we get people more aware of that 10% we're aware of? And are they capable of it? Is there an environment that permits them to do it? If you're starving, there's no time for that. If the survival brain is working, there's no, like you said, Ken, you can't do it. Now, how do we think bigger picture? That's not my bailiwick, about how to get certain groups of people to not worry about survival, that Maslow hierarchy of values. So, whew.
And how do we undo the evolutionary mismatches too? How do we get people to stop? Or was it Edward O. Wilson who said we've developed a Star Wars society with medieval institutions and Stone Age emotions? And,
well, look, I can say as a group therapist, there's a concept that the British group analysts call the group as a whole, which is modeled on this whole thing that there's a merger between the group, and that the way to deal with the group is learn about this kind of merger that goes along. And many analytic theorists have thought about it. And how do you get that group to unmerge from what they talk about, the transferences to the leader? Okay, so you see it on a small scale, and it's very hard. And that's just a small group of people who are interested, who the therapist, let's say, reasonably selects the participants, so there's enough of a good match of different things that, depending on your theory. So this bigger picture thing is quite complex, but it's great that we're talking about it too. Yeah.
okay, great. Bruce, why don't you chime in here?
Sorry, I've been. This is intriguing. Listening to the whole dialogue, but my background's in community psychology. So when you start talking about the leveling up, it's definitely what I do, and I'm thinking about this combining community psych with neurobiology, and sort of tying in polyvagal theory and what you've been talking about in terms of the co-regulation, and that the idea that we as humans are evolutionarily designed to be interactive with each other. Whether we talk about mirror neurons or we talk about the co-regulation, there's parts of our brain that only get activated in the presence of another person. So we are inherently social creatures. And the key in terms of, like, we're talking about taking leadership to transform the way in which this planet operates, right? And the key piece of any leader or teacher or facilitator is they have to be more regulated and more grounded than everyone around them. They need to, because I forget who said this, the previous speaker said, you can also co-dysregulate the people around you. Right. So I had a story. My partner was over in England and loves to go walking. And as you know, in England, there's paths that go everywhere. And so she's walking through a field and there's like 30 or 40 cows there. And she's getting a little nervous. And the cows start turning around and looking at her and they start moving towards her. And she's getting more and more nervous. And she's realizes, oh, I'm dysregulating the herd. And because she has a lot of experience with mindfulness and with grounding, she just said, okay, I need to go back. I need to regulate myself. I need to be grounded. And she just, with breathing and attention, and then their tone of voice, and she was just talking to the cows, like, hi, I'm just here passing through. And very gently, they just started mellowing out, turning away, and giving space. So she was able to co-regulate an entire herd of cows. Now, wow. So this is this thing about whether various different species have consciousness. I'm not going to advocate for ants, but certainly within the mammals, we have this capacity. So and so part of that is a mindfulness training, because you have to be able to get to the place where you are sufficiently regulated that you're co-regulating people around you. So what do we need to do in pro-social to create environments, atmospheres, leaders where people are actually co-regulating rather than co-dysregulating each other? I don't have an immediate answer for that, but it's an interesting, this sort of ties into the evolutionary state of co-regulation, which is developed to create society and cooperation. So it's already here. We already have it in our biology. How do we teach that, and how do we manifest that, particularly when we live in a culture which teaches us the opposite?
Yes, and we have to deal with evolutionary fictions that argue against it and all that. Sage, did you have a thought?
Yeah, I just like the conversation focusing at the kind of group level, and Bruce, the idea of co-regulation, I think puts it really well. Thinking about both contextual behavior and how we're able to be flexible in what we respond and give attention to, and how we do that. And then there's also the sort of longer term cultural piece, which is how these patterns of behavior that we practice ourselves can actually be instituted as norms, sort of group patterns and practices, policies, those kinds of things that also externalize some of the responsibility from the individual. So like you imagine in a group with very few norms, it'll only survive from the flexibility of its members to deal with all of the dysregulation. And then as patterns and kind of a value orientation becomes more clear, so there is, like, I think maybe, especially when you really, that's just within a group, that seems maybe overkill. But if you think about over like a region, a biosphere, a nation, a state, like it's at the more cultural level that I think co-regulation is going to happen, because no individuals can possibly deal with trying to co-regulate, you're even just the fellow citizens of a town at the same time. So We need some higher level structures, but that are informed and respondent to the lower level responding. So I guess my question in that when I get to that space, it is like, there are institutions and norms that have cultures that do this well. And I think it's really, whether it's a monastery or a venture capitalist startup, you know, so I think there is a lot to be translated from this view.
Yeah, the other problem, the problem is that, as we've said, it really kind of needs to come from the top. The problem is that in democratic countries, everything starts from the bottom. And all the top does is try to appease as many people from the bottom as is necessary to get a majority of the votes next time.
Well, I would almost frame it more micro macro, and there needs to be a functional relationship between the two. Right now it's more like macro micro, because the bottom, what we're saying, is more of a like hierarchy, and the top is actually a much smaller group of people making decisions for a large group. So the amount of information that they're actually responding to is very narrow. You'd want the higher level thing to actually be bigger in some ways than the micro.
Okay, we've got a quick Hank, a quick Bruce, and then I think we might be running out of time.
Okay,
have
just quick.
unlimited
Oh.
time, but go ahead.
Just quickly, going back to group analytic thinkers and the philosophers before that, I want to go back to, not that I'm puffing up Freud, but he did write in The Ego and Group Psychology, which some of you are familiar with. He talks about when you join a group, there's a great danger for the loss. He uses the word of the superego, but I'm going to use the term, there's a loss of critical thinking, like the virus that Andy Norman talks about. And we can see it in any political thing or what's going on in this country with one of our potential leaders, where there is really a loss. We don't know why so many people in that mob are losing critical thinking about something obvious. So let's just keep that in mind, that there are worlds out there that try to address that mostly for me, it's on a clinical level and maybe at organizations, but I've not succeeded in doing that in any organizational work that I've done. So I stopped doing it, but I'm sorry, but whoever, I know Lon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's an element here that needs
Bruce,
to be considered, and it's called counterwill. And they thought about it in early therapy, one of Freud's colleagues, and it's been talked about with children. But if it's present in children are the archetype of complex adaptive systems. It's present in everybody, and it needs to be dealt with. And it means that when somebody from top down tells you to do something, you're automatically resistant.
Mm-hmm.
And that builds counterwill. Counterwill grows into insurgencies to get violent. So address counterwill, and you do that by negotiating.
All right, thank you. Bruce?
Yeah, I just wanted to share, again, doing community psych tends to be more practical than theoretical. And we just, up in Nova Scotia, we just created a new not-for-profit called the Good Neighbor Builders Society. And the idea is that we want to change the norms of how people connect and how neighborhoods connect. And that we want it to be the norm that people know, connect, and care about each other. And so we're starting a series of activities. We've got one of the local towns has agreed to become the first good neighbor community. They're going to be doing some launches and the idea is to create neighborhood connectors and to train neighborhood connectors. And this isn't about internet. This is about the people that are around you that you connect with, and introducing principles of everything from sense of community to co-regulation to, what do we need to do to get people to create events, create community events, start creating connections. So it's an interesting, we've been also negotiating with towns. We've also negotiating with landlords of apartment complexes. And so we're trying to say to a landlord, what would it be like if your apartment was a community rather than just a bunch of people living together? There's a lot of research to show that that would decrease the amount of property damage. It might decrease turnover. So there's some financial benefits for them, but also there's a sense of both in towns and in business that creating community and creating ways where people come together and care for each other rather than just being isolated competition is starting to pick up. So it'd be interesting to see how we're just kicking off, that we have a number of landlords in 2 or 3 towns that we're going to start implementing this idea of being a good neighbor is the norm rather than.
I think that's something, first of all, that needs.
So interesting to see how that will roll out.
Yeah, I think that's something that needs a lot more publicity within pro-social world, because that's what pro-social is doing. And I would think that a presentation based on that, either at Examine Lives or someplace else, would be the way to go. And I would push for that. I think Diane, your hand, and I think that's probably going to be it for time. I have unlimited time. But...
It's very short, because I was going to say exactly what you're saying. I think we should do a session on norms and normativity and counter-normativity and so on and so forth. Ever since Sage talked, I've been thinking, this is really a key piece. And I think that our tendency to create and follow norms and to rebel against them are all probably embedded in evolution somehow or another.
Well, keep in mind, Diane, that if you the way we work now is that if you suggest a topic and everybody wants to do it, you get to select the article or two and lead the discussion. So in the interest of time, and I put in the chat that our next meeting is on April 18th, and we're going to do it on shame and guilt, and I'll post an article on that. And then we have at least 2 other topics that have been suggested. Ken had suggested doing something on disgust, which I think would be good. And Diane's topic on norms, I think, would also be good. So we might have the next couple of months at least mapped out. Diane, are you willing at in either May or June to lead a discussion on what you just suggested?
Okay.
Okay.
I should be able to pull something together by then.
Okay. All right. I've got to go. You guys can keep talking if you want to, but I've got to be somewhere. So I'm going to sign off.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for the discussion.
Yes, thank you
very much, everyone, for
yes,
coming.
thanks, Ken.
Appreciate it.
Great topic.
Thanks, Ken.
Put
Good one.
that website for Good Neighbor Builder in the chat if people are interested.
Okay, I guess you can kill the recording now, Sage, and